Today on Authentic, Sunshine and Roger start the discussion of the SM-2 missile by reviewing the history of fleet air defense and the missile systems that provided the basis for the SM-2 Standard Missile. This is Authentic.
Hey, Roger. How are you these days?
Hey, Sunshine, I'm well. How are you?
Good, man. No complaints. San Diego in July, not too shabby. How about the East Coast?
Virginia in July, alternately shabby, stormy, wet, humid, but that's okay.
That's okay. Yeah, we kind of pay a
Yeah,
fair weather tax out here, so I guess I'm making good on my fair weather tax this month. How
there you
about that?
go. Yeah, and as we've said before, I do get season changes, so
Yeah, which
there
I
is
am
that.
jealous, especially in the fall, man. I'll tell you what, nice actually does get boring. I got to admit
Yeah,
when it comes to weather. So,
yeah.
hey, I was wondering. Traditionally, you'll interview me on a topic and we'll roll through something like we did the AIM-9X. But I was thinking, hey, today, what if we mixed it up a little bit? And I don't know. Let's say I ask the questions.
Hey, let's do it. I like that idea. What should
All
we
right.
talk about?
Well, I'm kind of the air-to-air guy, and with your background, which is varied actually. But I would say, what if we, let's see, focused on some kind of a surface there thing?
Surface air, I did some of that. You know, how about the standard missile, man? Because that way I can give standard answers.
I I like it. I like the pun too, but also yeah, because
Yeah.
to me, I think of the SM, 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, whatever. They're all kind of
Mhm.
a family that's a cornerstone of theater air
Yeah.
defense, wouldn't you say?
Not just theater air defense, but all air defense. So, and we can talk about that. What theater air defense means, because obviously, for me as a former Aegis guy, I sort of get in the weeds about all those terms, right? So,
I'll tell you what, I'll let you run down rabbit holes, but then I'll put a leash on you to try to pull you back up
sounds good to
from
me,
there.
man.
Awesome. Hey, so with the standard missile, we got the family as we talked about earlier, and I
Mhm.
I tend to think of them as the family kind of started back in around 45, 1945, World War II, kind of
E-
familiar. You remember the Battle of Leyte Gulf?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, so we can either talk about it now or down the road when we get more into the history. But for me, it's the Battle of Leyte Gulf and the kamikazes really kind of created a demand signal, wouldn't you say, for SM?
It did. So there was the kamikazes in the Pacific, and there were a couple of German weapons in the Mediterranean, in particular, off Sicily. So let's talk about those, and then let's talk about what a battle group is too, right? So chicken and the egg. So
Perfect.
let's talk about the threat. So the threat to, we'll just call them battle groups, even though they
Sure.
weren't back there in World War II,
Yeah.
was the kamikaze, as you said, which, and I'm not trying to be flippant about it, but it was the original smart weapon, right? We literally, as a human race, we put a man in the weapon and had that crash into the ship. So obviously, if you know the history of the U.S. Navy, one of the worst weapons we faced in terms of number of losses of men and ships. And while that was going on off Okinawa and Iwo Jima, or actually about a year prior, the Germans were using two weapons called the Henschel HS-293
Okay.
and another weapon that goes by a couple names, the Rüstall SD-1400X or Fritz X or Fritz 10. Those were both glide bombs. So they were dropped off a bomber at altitude and glided to their target. They had a couple, handful, 5, 6, 7, 8 mile range. They would glide to the target, commanded by radio control from a bombardier in the aircraft, who would look at these immensely bright flares in the tail of the glide bomb and guide it to the target. And the Germans had some notable success with those, getting somewhere between 30 and 50 soft ships, if you will, so destroyers or transports, and 7 armored ships. The big
Oh,
difference between these two weapons, the HS-293 was meant for soft targets, and the Fritz was meant for hard targets.
okay. And then the difference,
And
I'm sorry, the
yeah,
difference would be in the warhead, I'm assuming, the
the
hard versus
warhead,
soft
what
target.
kind of penetrator? Yeah, whether or not it was purely high explosive or armor piercing, and they look different. They were designed differently, but in terms of employment, um, essentially the same. And
Okay.
then eventually the Fritz at at the very end had a camera in the nose, which would actually
Oh,
transmit its picture back to the bombardier in the aircraft. And
okay.
so instead of trying to track the flares, much like a Maverick missile would do today, the bombardier would watch this little camera picture that was transmitted to the nose. So obviously, the further away he was didn't hurt, right? The accuracy got better the closer the missile got to the target.
Absolutely. So could you almost relate this to a very crude, rudimentary initial, I guess, or predecessor to Slam ER?
Yes, very much so.
Okay, but
Yeah,
yet this is World War II Germany versus 1980s U.S. Navy.
exactly. Right.
Okay, wow. Okay, cool.
Right. So you've got those two things going on. And this led to something called Project Bumblebee in the late 1940s. And the Navy executed Project Bumblebee to create a mid-layer defense between the aircraft that were standing CAP patrols, combat air patrols. By the end of the war, Hellcats, Corsairs going after those kamikazes, and the guns that were on the cruisers, which were actually the prevalent air defense ship for the fleet at that point. The battleships were there. They also had everything had a plethora of anti-aircraft guns, right? Because by 1945, there is essentially no Japanese fleet anymore. We're defending against aircraft.
Okay, so if you don't mind though, before Operation Bumblebee, you're saying that the defenses on the ships, so that would be the short range guns or long range aircraft, right?
Mm-hmm.
There was no adequate defense against the kamikazes.
Well, it depends on what you define as adequate,
Okay,
right? So, we shot down, or I shouldn't say we shot down. The Japanese lost a lot more kamikazes than hit their targets, and there's a lot of reasons for that. But we developed a lot of tactics to counter them because it was a much larger threat, at least perceived, than the German glide bombs, and it really defined the Navy's methodology of how to defend. And this is probably the good place to then start talking about what a carrier battle group was. They're called carrier strike groups now. But if you think back to the Battle of Midway, we talked about task forces, and those gave way to carrier battle groups after the end of the war. And a carrier battle group is a self-contained naval unit that is centered around an aircraft carrier. And it's got the aircraft carrier, it's got what we now know as the air wing, at the time the air group, but it's also got a ring of defensive ships. And by the end of World War II, there were a dozen or maybe more of these around every aircraft carrier. And they would form a ring with cruisers and the battleship nearer to the center of the aircraft carrier, and then an outer ring of destroyers that had lighter guns. And even further out than that, down something we call the threat axis that we'll talk about more, which is the direction from which you think the enemy is most likely to come, you'd have what we called a picket destroyer. And the picket destroyer's job would be to go way down that threat axis, and with the early radars, double or even triple the range of first detection from the carrier using the radar of the incoming raids.
Okay,
and what
Oh, I'm sorry. So the picket ship though runs it's it's closer to the threat. We'll say closer to the along the threat axis, closer to the ingress vector. Now, is that sacrificial? Do you know, or is it just early warning? And how does that work?
Well, alone and unafraid, right, is the term for when you're out there on your own. It wasn't meant to be sacrificial. It wasn't, in the way that maybe a blade of armor or a decoy is meant to be sacrificial. But in fact, in actuality, destroyers and picket destroyers took more kamikaze losses from kamikazes than any other ship. Okay. So it wasn't designed to be sacrificial. It was designed to give first warning, early warning, because we're talking the days before Hawkeyes, right? So your radar would only see as far as the horizon allowed you. And if you could push a destroyer out 20, 30 miles, you increase the radar horizon out 20 or 30 miles.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point, radar horizon. So, we're not talking, forget about atmospherics, ducting, all the stuff that happens in the air, right, that can affect, we'll say, RF transmissions, but just pure geometry of radar antenna height versus curvature of the Earth. If you're 65 feet high, I think it's about a 10 nautical mile horizon.
You're about dead on. So from the bridge wing of a Arleigh Burke class destroyer at 65 feet, I think you're dead on. It's 11 miles to the horizon.
11. Okay, yeah.
So, right. And so your radar's seeing about 10 because your radar's a couple feet below you.
Okay, so if you're seeing 10 miles and then you put a picket ship 30 miles in front of the formation or 30
Mhm.
miles toward the enemy, I guess. Yeah, I could see how that definitely opens the aperture for early warning.
Absolutely. And of course back then we're not necessarily looking at kamikazes coming in at wave top height, right?
Yeah.
They're going to be up, but they're not at the altitudes we're thinking today, either 20 or 30,000 feet. They're coming in lower than that. So
Yeah, they're prop jobs and they're in the high teens
yeah,
maybe or low
and I think
20s.
we were expecting to see contacts maybe 40 to 50 miles out, maybe a little bit more at that
Okay.
point. So you can almost double that range and double the warning.
Okay. Cool. And then, hey, as you were describing the what I'm going to call the carrier strike group, right, or the battle
Yeah.
group here. So we talked a little. There's going to be a carrier there, but in the meantime, you have cruisers, destroyers, frigates,
Mhm.
right? Um, how, in layman's terms, I guess, so to a pilot, how about that? To me,
Yeah.
how would you explain the difference between a cruiser, a destroyer, and a frigate when it comes to capabilities, maybe size, displacement?
Yeah. So let's take this in a little bit of a time phase discussion. And let's
Okay,
go Cold War and earlier and we'll go now, right?
sure.
Because there's been a huge change. Traditionally, and I'm talking in the age of steam, right? Back in the day, a frigate was the ship of the line. But
Yeah.
sort of in a World War II up to the end of the Cold War definition, your frigate is on the small end of the spectrum. Frigate's normally known as an anti-submarine escort vessel, used in convoys, things like that, along with a couple other smaller ships. Destroyers were traditionally a little bit larger than a frigate, and they were known for anti submarine warfare. That's generally what they did at the beginning of World War II. Though, as with everything, they started getting more and more anti aircraft guns. Then you get up to the cruiser level, and up until the 60s, there was a differentiation between light cruisers and heavy cruisers, really based on the size of the gun. If you had a 6-inch gun, you were a light cruiser. If you had an 8-inch gun, you were a heavy cruiser. But the cruiser's real role was twofold. One, it was that anti-aircraft ring of steel around the aircraft carrier, and two, it's where it derives its name. It was a ship that was capable of long-range operations on its own,
Mhm.
unlike a destroyer, and it had more speed than all but say the Iowa and North Carolina class battleships, which were known as fast battleships. So a cruiser was essentially fast enough to run away from the battleships that it couldn't fight, and heavy enough to fight anything smaller than
Okay, cool.
it.
And since
Yeah,
okay, great. That's awesome. So basically,
yeah,
small or limited capabilities, all the way up to big or large capabilities, it would be frigate, destroyer, cruiser, right?
right, exactly. And that's where we were coming out of the Second World War. That's where the surface to air missile story starts to impact the way we design our ships. And we could talk about that evolution as we get into the missile design, I think, is sort of the natural place. But as we're looking at the need to design these missiles, you could sort of set frigates aside. They were an anti-submarine warfare ship. Your battle group had, or strike group at the now, had destroyers and cruisers primarily, because battleships are a topic fraught with angst and much gnashing of teeth among the surface warfare crowd, as should we have gotten rid of them, so on, even now. But for the most part, through the Cold War, your carrier strike groups, then battle groups, were protected by cruisers and destroyers. And up until the advent of the surface to air missile, there was a very clear delineation. Destroyers protected you against submarines, and cruisers protected you against aircraft.
Oh wow, okay. And then you had also mentioned outrunning. You said the cruiser can outrun certain things. If
Mhm.
so, help me out here. A long time ago, and it could have been a SWO buddy of mine pulling my leg, but he would say if you're given equal displacement, right, and equal
Mhm.
engine power, then something that's longer and skinnier is going to move more quickly, be less stable, but kind of faster. Whereas something that's wider and shorter is going to move less quickly, but it's going to be more stable. So is that kind of a good rule of
That's
thumb?
generally true. Yeah,
Okay.
that is generally true, and you can see that jumping way forward to the Ticonderoga class cruisers and the Arleigh Burke class destroyers. Tycos are built on a Spruance hull. They're
Yeah.
564 feet long and 55
Nice.
feet wide, if memory serves.
Wow.
And the
Bravo.
Burks are 505 feet long and 66 feet wide. And
Okay,
so, in my experience, now there are things that change, right? And
sure.
if it were exact apples to apples, you should theoretically get a little more speed out of the Tycho, even though she displaces about 1,000 tons more, about 10% more.
Okay, gotcha. Good. Well, okay, so that makes perfect sense. And then, so we have these different layered defenses, we'll call them, right? Is there
Hmm.
a certain
Yeah.
term, would you say, for that fleet defense?
Well, I'd say it's fleet air defense
Okay,
in the notion that we're talking now. So there's, people have called it the Ring of Steel. They've called it the carrier screen, the battle group. But in this term, in this context, it's fleet air defense. And people are probably used to hearing the term fleet air defense primarily associated with the F-14, right? Because it was designed as a fleet air defense fighter. But fleet air defense is a lot more than that. It is the F-14, it's the E-2 Hawkeye, it's the carrier, it's the cruiser, which, by the way, is usually the CEO of the senior cruiser, is the commander of the air defense team for the entire carrier strike group. It's the destroyers, it's the cruiser, it's everybody.
okay. So I would traditionally, if I was going to go fly with F-18s, go fly combat air
Mhm.
patrol, or really we call it DCA, right? Defensive counter air.
Right? Defensive counter air.
Yeah, I'm on the carrier, obviously. I go down to the Zulu module and talk to the
Mhm.
Desron rep, right? So
Right?
when I'm talking to the Desron rep, who is the Desron? Who are they in charge of?
Right. So we've talked about the carrier and its ring of steel, right? So what we're
Yeah.
talking about now with the carrier, let's talk about that. Let's talk about the strike group composition, and I'll
Okay.
give sort of a generic one, right? You've
Sure.
got and it's had different names. The carrier battle group in World War II, it was the task force. Now it's the carrier strike group, and that's commanded by an admiral.
Okay.
And that admiral, he or she own all of the assets that are within this battle group. And if you go one echelon down from that, you have the O6 commands, if you will, right? So
Hmm.
that's going to be the carrier itself, the carrier air wing, right, which is commanded by the CAG. Those are both going to be O6s.
Hmm.
And then you're going to have one or maybe two cruisers along with that. And those are commanded by O6s as well. Then the Desron is a destroyer squadron, which is, as time goes by, it's varied between an operational, an administrative, and a both operational and administrative command. But the destroyer squadron, or Desron, is the organization that manages the 2 to 6 destroyers that are going to be associated with that battle group.
Okay, and then those guys are going to help build the surface picture. Is that a true statement? The
They
Desron?
are. So, the Desron is generally going to be the anti surface and anti subsurface warfare coordinator. So, when we look at a battle group, you have warfare coordinators. So, you have the anti air warfare coordinator. As I said, that's going to be the CO of the cruiser and his CIC staff there, which is why you probably, oddly enough, don't interface as much with them because they're not physically on the carrier. They're the one uh, you know, warfare. We call them warfare commanders that aren't. And if we call battle groups are known by letters, or at least they used to be. And
Okay.
on the radio, we still use those letters. So if we use, say, Bravo, right? If we're carrier
Sure.
strike group Bravo,
Yeah.
then Bravo Alpha is the commander of the strike group, right?
Okay.
And Bravo Whiskey is the call sign for that air warfare commander, right? And then you've got Bravo Sierra is the Desron, the surface, subsurface, and you've got these guys for strike warfare with the Tomahawks who also work in with the land strike element of the air wing, so on and so forth.
Okay. So you said there's actually
So
a BS commander? Did I?
there is a BS commander. Most of them are actually, but I should have used Foxtrot.
There you go.
um, so all these warfare areas have their different warfare commanders. So who you're used to going to down and seeing is that Desron Commodore or his staff, more
Yeah.
likely,
Yeah.
who, if you're working with the carrier, is going to be there on the carrier.
Okay.
Sometimes they ride the destroyer. One of the destroyers is their flagship, which is crowded. I'll say. I'll leave
Okay.
it there. We're really not. Our destroyers really aren't meant to be flagships anymore.
Gotcha. Okay,
Yeah.
so I did a brief with a Desron to get a surface picture. I blast off. Now let's say I switch missions and I go out. Let's say I'm in Iraq, whatever. I go far away from the carrier for whatever reason.
Hmm.
And as I'm coming home, the first guy I check in is with Red Crown.
Right.
Now, who is Red Crown and where does he hang out?
So Red Crown is generally going to be the other cruiser. So the one who is not the air warfare commander, but really nowadays it could be a destroyer. It can be anybody. Traditionally, it's a ship that has good radar
Okay.
capability and good comms capability. And Red Crown, I believe, is a term, as a concept, it goes way back. As a term, I believe it comes out of Vietnam.
Yeah,
And Red
exactly.
Crown is the person who's essentially going to sanitize incoming aircraft. So you check in with Red Crown, and it is one of several ways, and I'll let you talk about the ways that the planes maneuver or do other things, but you to make sure we don't have fratricide or blue on blue. But you check in with Red Crown so that Red Crown can convey, hey, track 3124 comp 2 is Golden Dragon 203 and 204, right? And so now everyone, having looked at their air tasking order and knowing that those guys were coming out, they know now that this incoming track is a friendly.
Exactly. Yeah, and we work with traditionally Red Crown, and then on the carrier we have Strike, right? So
Right.
they're gonna be assessing the vital area, which I think is out. Well, I won't give any numbers, but the carrier vital area
Right.
is a certain distance from the carrier being the anchor of or the middle of the circle, and then we
Mm-hmm.
have our extended area out there too. So yeah, I like that. Okay, so
Right.
the cruiser. So if I want to think air to air picture, I'm going to think a cruiser. If I want to think a surface picture, I'm going to think a destroyer. And then destroyer could also be a subsurface as well as the frigates if they're still around.
Yeah, yeah, and we don't have any frigates in commission. We have a new frigate class that's on the design board, and that's probably a discussion for another day because that's a whole other can of worms.
Okay.
But let's it's sort of tough because let's roll this back into the Cold War
Okay.
era
Sure.
to talk about the standard. The reason I say that is, in my opinion, just one man's opinion, we've sort of become a very homogenous surface force.
Hmm.
So yes, we have cruisers and yes, we have destroyers,
Mm-hmm.
but we're looking to divest ourselves of our cruisers in the next 4 to 5 years.
Oh.
They're anywhere between 30 and 35 years old, and the big difference anymore between an Aegis cruiser and an Aegis destroyer is how large the comm suite is,
Hmm.
how many missile tubes you have, and there's some nuances about I don't want to get too far down this rabbit hole
I'm
due to
about to pull in the
classification.
leash. I'm about to pull in
Yeah,
the leash.
right. Well, this one's an offset classification.
Oh,
There
okay.
are some limitations on how many targets a destroyer can engage simultaneously as
Oh,
compared to a cruiser.
sure.
And even that isn't written in stone because of software changes. But for the most part, right now, especially with the Flight 2A destroyers, Arleigh Burks that have a helo hangar,
Yeah.
slightly smaller crew. I think the one of the bigger things is they have a little bit less range, but for all intents and purposes, we're a pretty homogenous force. But if you roll back to before the time when the Arleigh Burke was the predominant destroyer, and in fact, the predominant ship in the surface fleet, what
Mm-hmm.
you said is exactly true. In general, the cruisers are looking at the air warfare picture, the destroyers are looking at the subsurface picture, and really the surface picture is something that we didn't worry about that much. I know that sounds a little bit crazy, but for the vast majority of the Cold War, there was not a Soviet surface threat
Hmm.
that was good, that was something that our air wing wasn't going to be able to take care of. And in the same sort of layered approach, the idea was an alpha strike from the carrier would take out the Soviet surface fleet before it got anywhere near us, and then the surface ships could sort of mop up with their harpoons, or if we got caught napping, you'd have the harpoons. And in fact, and we'll get there, the Standard missile can be used in a surface to surface role.
Okay. And then when you say Alpha Strike, can you?
Hmm?
So for me as a pilot, I tend to think we're launching pretty much every available, so up and ready aircraft that has ASUW weapons on it. Is
That
that
is exactly what I'm thinking of
okay?
as well.
So
Yep.
all hands on deck evolution to focus on a very near
Right.
threat. Okay. Okay. So we got this different, layman's terms. So I appreciate that with the different focus points, if you will, for the
Yeah,
different
all
types
good.
of ships. But now, do the ships ever talk to each other? And could, with all this sensor fusion we have nowadays, could they build it into kind of one picture?
So now they do. Yeah, and this is maybe a good segue. Let's now step back to that Project Bumblebee, because we can do that now, but we couldn't back then. So back then in the late 1940s, it was very much a every ship for itself in terms of fire control, right?
Okay.
The only thing you're getting from another ship is a voice radio transmission telling you they have radar contact X bearing at so many miles. And depending on what sensor you use, maybe you would get the altitude as well. And it's into that um, setting that we realized we had this gap, this mid range gap from where the guns are hitting a couple miles out to where the cap is being stationed dozens, 70, maybe 80 miles out. So Project Bumblebee had a target of creating a missile system that could destroy a target up to 10 miles away, up to
Okay.
30,000 feet high,
Hmm.
with a single missile having a zero point 0.3 to zero point 0.6 PK, or probability of kill, that I know you're familiar with.
Yeah.
And they ran that program for about 10 years, starting in, I think, 1946.
Okay.
Some places you're probably familiar with: China Lake, White Sands. And there actually is still something out at White Sands called the USS Desert Ship, LLS-1, which stands for Landlocked Ship. Uh,
Nice.
Believe it or not, the Navy had to get congressional approval to call that USS Desert Ship. I know that sounds a little bit crazy. There's sort of a corresponding one out in New Jersey that is for Aegis, and we won't talk about that because that's
Okay.
still a thing, and we won't go there. But the outcome of Project Bumblebee, and they had a couple of things that sort of died on the vine, but the outcome of Bumblebee was what was called the three T's.
Okay.
All right. It was the Terrier, Talos, and Tarter missiles. Okay. And I'll run those down one at a time. The Terrier, or the RAM 2, and RIM is sort of like AIM-9, right? Is an air intercept missile, or air launched air intercept missile in the Tri-Service Rocket and Guided Missile Naming Designation System of 1963, which is,
Woo!
that time frame where everything went from F9F Panther to, just F8 Crusader, right?
Totally. It's
I know
kind of
that's no,
period
that's not the same plane,
standardization.
right?
Yeah.
Right. So R is surface launch. So RIM 2 is the Terrier. This was the medium range missile, and believe it or not, the Terrier body is exactly, for all intents and purposes, what you see on the standard missile today. But that original Terrier RIM 2 was medium range. We'll talk about what that means in a minute. It was a two-stage missile, which meant it had a small booster and then sustainment rockets. And it was a beam rider. Are you familiar with beam riders? I don't know that we've ever even tried beam riding with air-launched missiles, because I don't think it would work.
I am, yeah, and you're right. It hasn't, to the fact that we basically, and viewer listeners out there, feel free to correct me,
Mhm.
but we went from the beam riding concept, air to air wise. We said no, the best, most effective, let's say, for that kind of concept though, is going to be semi-active radar. So we're going to
Right.
look for,
Exactly.
we're going to just basically look for an off-board. So if I'm the weapon running downrange, I got
Mhm.
to listen to my launching platforms or a separate platform's radar and use those returns as opposed to
Right.
beam riding. Yeah. So
So, in the mid 1950s, which is when Terrier had its IOC, or initial operational capability, it was a beam rider. And what that means is you had a weapons director. So if you're looking at a ship and you see it probably has two or more circular radar dishes, right? It's what you think of when you see a radar dish in the movies. And that would send out a beam that would lock onto the target, and the missile would simply keep itself within the parameters of that beam. It wasn't really so much looking at the target as it was keeping itself in that cone. If you take a flashlight and you shine the flashlight and think about the missile saying, I want to stay within the flashlight beam, that's what it was doing. But of course, that has some notable drawbacks. One of which is that cones, by their definition, get larger the further away they get from their source. And that leads to a maximum range restriction. It also means that you have to have a sensor on the missile and a warhead on the missile that is paired to how wide that beam is that you think its maximum range. So the Terrier had a 10 nautical mile max range, which seems pretty anemic right now, right? So
Absolutely.
only shooting out to 10 miles is your fleet air defense weapon. It could only target subsonic targets, and it flew at about Mach 1.9. But when you think about what it was designed to defend against, we were not thinking in terms of anti ship cruise missiles when this project started. We were thinking about getting the bomber that was dropping that German glide bomb or getting the kamikaze. So 10 miles was okay at that point. But of course, as time went by, there were some later developments, nuanced things. They went from forward control surfaces to aft control surfaces. They got better rocket motors that pushed the range out to 40 nautical miles. And eventually, they picked up the semi-active radar homing uh, terminal homing, which is what you were discussing with aircraft, where the launch platform actually illuminates the target and the missile homes on the reflected radar off that target. And of course, it was the 1950s, so where we would be without a nuclear option. Most of these had a blast warhead. There was that nuclear option warhead, a small one. And the thought process behind that was by the time you're getting out to 40 miles and you don't have the best target resolution, you can take out an aircraft with even further than a near miss with this nuclear warhead. And they were small. I don't know the kiloton range off the top of my head, but the idea was that it wasn't even so much the thermal pulse; it was the blast was going to knock the aircraft out of control.
Okay, gotcha. So that's the Terrier. How about
That's the Terrier.
the Terrier's warhead? Was that more of a blast frag or continuous
It
rod?
was a
Or
blast frag warhead, apart from that nuclear one, and it was somewhere in the 300 or 400 pound range of a warhead, so not insubstantial. Fairly decent warhead. And these were pretty small. They were small enough for most of the Navy ships at the time. They could fit them onto just about anything using what's called a Mark 10 twin arm launcher. And if you go far enough back into the 80s, there's some Navy recruiting commercials with some of the first Aegis cruisers where you see this twin arm launcher rotate through 3 degrees and bring two missiles up, and it twists outward. And for the time, it was a pretty advanced system. And the Terrier was actually used successfully in combat for the first time on April 19th, 1972. The USS Sterett, which was what I'll call a steam cruiser, and we'll talk about that here in a second. CG-31 shot down a North Vietnamese MiG-17 during the Battle of Dong Hoi, which maybe we should do a show on that one day because it was actually a naval battle of the Vietnam War, which I think most people don't know about.
which are they are naval battles are kind of few and far between for the Vietnam era. So
Yeah, pretty much, especially if you're talking anything beyond a riverboat
well, that's true. Brown water Navy,
type
different
conflict,
story.
right? Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah. That's so true.
So, so I mentioned that this was fired off the Sterett CG-31, which was a steam cruiser. What I mean by that is, let's take a look at how these missiles developed. And I talked about the Terrier, and it could fit
Sure.
on most ships. And it IOC'd there in the mid 1950s. But at this point, we didn't have any purpose designed ships to carry these things. We were still in that era of cruisers, which were sort of an anti-air warfare platform, and the destroyers, which would be anti-submarine warfare platforms. So they went ahead and they tried to modify these by adding them to these old gun cruisers and gun destroyers to see what they could do. And for the most part, it was successful, but they determined we needed to start building something a little bit more purpose built.
Hmm.
And the reason for this was, keep in mind, at a 10-mile maximum range, that's fine against a manned aircraft at the time that doesn't have its own guided missile. But of course, we see in 1960, the Soviets develop what is now widely known as probably the best known anti-ship cruise missile in history, the SSN-2 Styx missile, which was also the first missile used to sink a ship at sea, Egyptian patrol boat sinking an Israeli patrol boat, 1967, I believe.
Sounds right. Late 60s.
So,
Yeah.
yeah. So with that, the Navy said, well, the Terrier's great, but then they developed something called the Talos,
Okay.
the Rim 8. And Talos, I thought was sort of cool naming. A lot, Terrier, right? Because it's small, and I guess it's sort of nipping at your heels. And
Yeah,
the
right.
later Tarter, which I'm sure there's a different name for or different meaning for Tarter. Maybe the Crimean Russian. But of course, I always think tartar sauce. Why are you going to name a missile after that? But
Or the stuff on your
uh,
teeth, yeah.
yeah, exactly right. Oh shoot, are we doing video? But uh, Taylor, are you familiar with the Talos name? Have you heard of where that came from?
Yeah, from Greek mythology, right? Wasn't that the bronze
Dead
kind
on.
of robot or automaton, I guess, that would cruise around and protect? Was it Europa? Is that right?
It
Or
was
Crete?
Crete. It
Crete?
was.
Yeah,
I thought it was Crete. Might have been Europa, but
yeah,
yeah, you're dead on. And it's cool because it would shoot out there, and then the idea is, it was bronze, so it would just embrace its target and then heat red hot and immolate its target. And so that was the theory, right,
Oh,
of
I
this
didn't know
name. We
how
have
it
a
actually
long
tracked the.
range.
Okay, yeah, yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
nice.
Some ancient Greek swacking. I wonder if we have to put a parental wording now that I've used that phrase. Okay. Anyway, uh, Talos was designed as the long range component. It was also a two-stage missile, but it had a rocket booster. But instead of a rocket motor, it was a ramjet sustainer, and it was
Sustainer.
actually,
Oh wow. Okay.
yeah. So it would boost off its launcher with a rocket, and then the ramjet is what would keep it going to give it, decent long range. We'll talk about that in a minute. And they're pretty interesting looking missiles because to have that ramjet up front, of course, you need an air intake, which is
Yeah.
something a normal rocket doesn't need.
Right.
So the front of a Talos missile looks very reminiscent of a MiG 21 with four little radar detection prongs around the perimeter or circumference of that air inlet.
Okay,
And
and
it
then
started out, yeah,
oh, I'm sorry, and then it's got the cone, right? Basically of the MiG 21. You're saying?
the sort of shot cone, right?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
Cool.
same thing for the ramjet. And these started out with beam riding for its mid-course guidance, because you're talking about a long enough range that you want to get it out close to its target, and then it would go semi-active radar homing terminal. So that was from the beginning. It was terminally going to be semi-active. It also came online in the mid 1950s,
Mhm.
but when it started, it was going out to 50 nautical miles to target something, and it was traveling at Mach 3.
Hmm. So we had our
And then mhm,
sorry. So you had the Terrier going out to 10 right nautical miles, and then you have the
10,
Talos.
yep, 10, later 40, and then the Talos went out to 50 originally, and then ultimately got to between 100 and 130-mile range.
Wow.
So yeah, so we started at an inner range of 10 and an outer range at 40, 50 rather, and then went to an inner range of 40 and an outer of 130.
Okay. Nice.
And yeah, and this saw the first use, I believe, of the continuous rod warhead that we talked about in the
Ah.
AIM-9
Mm-hmm.
episode,
Okay.
which has a lot of benefits for how much shrapnel it puts out in a very directed ring. As usual for the 19s and 50s and 60s, it had a nuclear option. It also had a unified warhead option, which is one of those things that if you're not a weaponeer or you're not an ordnance guy, doesn't sound as exciting. But the unified warhead option meant that the same missile could take either a conventional warhead or a nuclear warhead. And so what that meant was you didn't have to choose your loadout on limited magazine space before you deployed. Like, oh, how bad, is the Cold War going to turn hot on this deployment? Do I need half nuclear and half conventional? Which I never think we hit that ratio, but you would have the ability to just carry the missile bodies in equal numbers of warheads for whatever you wanted to do. And ultimately, they had an anti radiation missile version, which, if you think of the harm missile that we use today,
Mm-hmm.
and people generally think of SEED and suppression of enemy air defenses and harms and the advanced harms coming online going after ground-based radars. Well, we do that with fleet air defense as well. And I'm not sure if the AMRAAM does it, but I know the Phoenix had a home on jam capability. And this is one of those places where that picket ship could really sort of come into its own if your picket was big enough to have a Talos, which there were only about a dozen ships big enough. But if you get into Cold War Soviet doctrine for how they were going to attack a battle group, right, you were going to have your Bear reconnaissance aircraft coming out to find the carrier strike group, and then you'd have, well, originally back in the day, Bears were even the bombers, but eventually Badgers and backfires. Well, if you can home on the jammers that came with that attack force, you can take out the jammer, which makes the task of the rest of your fleet air defense force much easier.
Okay.
So, but then what's the downsize of the Talos? Why don't we just put this on every ship? Well, this thing was big. It was the size of a contemporary fighter jet, right? So it was not a small missile. It was limited to large cruisers. Like I said, only about a dozen. Essentially, the true cruisers from World War II, which were far larger even than a Ticonderoga class cruiser now in terms of length and displacement. You're talking probably 800-foot long cruisers as
Hmm.
opposed to our 500 and some odd foot ones now.
Okay.
Somewhere in the 15 to 20,000 ton range. And then the USS Long Beach. You probably never saw the Long Beach, I'm guessing. I saw her right at the very end of her career.
Oh, okay.
Man, she was an enormous ship. If you do you remember what the island of the Enterprise looked like?
Yeah, a Big E. You're saying
Of
the
CVN
carrier?
65? Yeah.
Yeah, totally.
Imagine that island on like a 750 or 800-foot long surface ship
Man, I feel like you're
with just a
approaching.
bunch of missile batteries.
Yeah, I feel like you're almost approaching battleship size again.
It was coming pretty close. So you can imagine how difficult that was. We couldn't use this missile on a whole bunch of our ships. So that was one of the limitations. Oh, I guess I did want to mention before we wrap the Talos that it had a pretty decent war record as well. There, it had multiple kills from, even though it had a small number of ships, including 4 MiG kills off of Vietnam. One was at 65 nautical miles, and it was a double kill. It blew up the leading MiG so significantly that the wingman flew directly into the wreckage and crashed.
Oh,
Yeah.
bad day for
And
them, good day
then,
for us. Yeah.
yeah, right.
Oh,
And then the ARM versions, the anti-radiation versions, were actually used to suppress North Vietnamese SAM radars along the coast. So if you're read or watched Flight of the Intruder,
mm-hmm.
or are aware of the linebacker raids in 1972, where we rolled back the air defenses, that those were used as part of that. They would take out the radar sites without risking the seed aircraft, which would be pushing further in. And in fact, I believe, I'm sure a listener will correct me if I'm wrong, they used these during the Sante raid, if you're
Hmm.
familiar with that one.
No, what's the
Have you
Sante
heard of
raid?
Sante? So
No.
yeah, here we are. Here, so rabbit hole. So keep my leash on,
Okay.
right? Um, in the latter stages of the Vietnam War, we thought we had a pretty good handle on a North Vietnamese prison camp where a bunch of our aviators were being held, and we staged one of the first special forces raids to try and get them out,
Hmm.
and it was ultimately unsuccessful. There is, depending on where you fall on the spectrum, evidence, conjecture, conspiracy theory that the word of the raid coming was leaked,
Oh,
and all the prisoners were moved a short time before the raid actually happened. The raid itself was successful in terms of how it was conducted by the Green Berets, with, in fact, sacrificially crashing a helicopter into the center of the compound
wow.
to deliver part of the strike force. But in any case, part of that was rolling back the air defenses,
Gotcha.
and
Okay,
that was
thanks.
done partially with Talos missiles. And excuse me. And then we had the Tarter, the Rim 24. This was a short range missile for the very small ships, the destroyers that were too small to take even the Terrier. And what it was the Terrier without its booster. And the booster was on the Terrier was relatively small. By way of comparison, the one on the Talos, the booster was as long as the missile.
I was noticing that, and I guess to get up to
Yeah,
Mach 3 with that kind of extended range too, with the ramjet, right? You need that
exactly.
length. Okay.
Exactly. So, and then the Tarter, the Rim 24, shorter range for smaller ships. It could be fired from a number of different launchers. And it came into use in the early 60s, but really there wasn't much development there because that's what paved the way for the Standard Missile, which is what we're actually here to talk about, right? So
Oh, that's right.
yeah, that's right. We're here to talk about the Standard Missile. Well, it's you and me. We'll go far afield. If we're not talking about X-wing versus Y-wing by the
There you
end of the
go.
show, I'll consider us doing good. Um, so this is maybe a good part to take a pause and say all that stuff we talked about at the beginning of the show with ships and ship types and why they're important.
Yeah.
Well, this is a big deal now, right? Because as I said, we had to convert these ships over to use these missiles. And it's at this point that the Navy says, well, we want to design one holistic family of missile, hence the Standard Missile family. And we want it to be fairly universal in how we can employ it. And so what we ended up with, while we had converted some other destroyers, we built something called the Charles F. Adams class destroyer.
Hmm.
Was 29 guided missile destroyers, and they were interestingly the last steam plant surface combatants the U.S. Navy built.
Oh, wow.
So ever since then, we've used gas turbines for our surface combatants, not our fibs, not anything else, but in terms of combatants. And this is probably a good time to mention. We've talked about these ships, and I've said cruisers, and I've said destroyers, and we've talked about frigates. But nowadays, we end up talking about CGs and DDGs, right?
Mm-hmm.
You've heard those terms.
Yep.
Let's talk about what those mean and where those came from. So if we go back to when the surface or any ship naming convention came about in the Second World War, naval officers, we can be really imaginative or we can be really not imaginative, right? So, well, battleships were the queen of the fleet there, right? So,
Absolutely.
battleship B, well, that makes a lot of sense. Well, we need two letters because we need to be really descriptive on some ships, but battleships are battleships. So, what are we going to call them? B. Let's go with
Perfect.
that. All right, two Bs, right? Cruisers came in those heavy and light configurations. So we had various permutations of CLs and CAs for anti-aircraft. And then we had things like destroyer escorts. Well, that all morphed after the war to really just giving us cruisers, which start with a C, and destroyers, which start with a D. And when these missiles came about, we said, well, we need to differentiate those ships because now this is where that real concept of cruisers are going to do air defense, destroyers are going to do anti-submarine warfare comes into play. So at that point, cruisers became CGs, cruiser guided missile, because we still had some gun cruisers left over, so we called those CGs. And the destroyers that we came up with were DDs, just destroyers, just general use destroyers. But this is where I lied to you a little bit earlier on, right? Because I said basically destroyers do anti-submarine warfare. Well, that's true unless they're guided missile destroyers. And that's where, for example, the Adams class DDGs came out. And that's because you remember how I told you we wanted to push those picket ships out there and we wanted to have that outer ring of steel. Well, as we developed these missiles, we didn't want to push a cruiser all the way out there, right? These are big ships. They're flagships. They're in close. They're riding what we call shotgun on the carrier, right? In close. Well, you needed a ship that we were able to build some more of that we could push out. And that really drove the need to have this single missile family because we didn't want to have two different radar systems. We didn't want to have two different fire control systems. So in 1963, we start development of what's now known as the Standard Missile family. And that's so it can fit all these different sizes of ships. And it replaced all three. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry. And also, Roger, speaking of commonality, which you referenced way in the beginning, you said that the SM-6, it shares the same missile body as the SM-1. Is that true?
Basically.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
There are some differences.
Right.
There, but yeah, basically it does. But you're right. And that's a great point, is that the missile that started out as the Terrier in 1963 as a beam rider to shoot a manned aircraft down at 10 nautical miles is now essentially the same airframe we're using to shoot down ballistic missiles and satellites.
Yeah, which is pretty cool. And so
pretty incredible.
Yeah, and so, the guy not used to the acquisition, development, test processes, I guess we'll say, you might think, well, that why are we being lazy or why are we being slow that we don't, upgrade the missile bodies too? But I think it
Hmm.
does it tend to come down to the requirements, the at sea requirements, the storage, the logistics, we'll say, of the high,
You're really dead on there. You're dead on, and it's sort of a perfect storm in a good way of all
okay,
these things.
okay,
So when we moved from the three T's, the Terrier, Talos, and Tarter, to the standard, the idea was let's make a missile that will fit in all these ships that we converted to shoot the Terrier. That's number one. And then as the design moved forward, we said, well, we might as well make all our new ships fit that as well. And then that, eventually it gave way to VLS and vertical launch systems, and we'll talk about that here nearer the end. But all of these things were designed around this one missile body. So to your point, we were procuring ships and said the body has to fit the launchers that we have. So that's one reason that this is the way it is. The other reason is, um, physics don't change, right? And to some extent, this we have optimized this missile body for what it does. And I should add, we've now developed a couple other missiles for very short range, and I'll talk about this a little bit when we get to the SM-2 MR in
okay.
particular,
Hmm.
because that's where I have a lot of my personal experience with those. But there's some things this missile body doesn't do well, and we've actually developed other missiles to do those things in the same way that while you can use an AMRAAM as a dogfight missile, right?
Hmm.
You've spent some money and some capability that the AIM-9 doesn't have, and you don't need that capability in that dogfight shot. It's sort of the same way in the missiles that we've developed to replace the not replace but to augment the standard in the short range role.
Okay, so while they share the same outer mold line, we'll say traditionally, at least
Hmm.
SM1 and 2, they're going to have different capabilities, different strengths and weaknesses.
Absolutely. And we won't go too far into this, but obviously metallurgy and material science has come a long way. So there's changes there as well. But the basic shape is fundamentally sound.
Gotcha.
And what that was, yeah, was the Terrier missile body uh now was reborn as the RIM 66, right? Going
Hmm.
back to that surface launched air intercept missile. For ease of purpose, I'm just going to call it the SM-1 and the SM-2
Okay.
at this point. And the RIM 66 were the medium range versions of these missiles. Because at this time, we're thinking the 60s, the 70s, we still had some launcher compatibility issues. So we made the SM-1, and that's where we'll start, medium range, or SM-1 MR. It became operational in 1968. It actually saw combat off of Vietnam in 1970. And all it was that Tarter body with new electronics. And not necessarily a different kind of of system. It was still semi-active radar homing, but just as time goes by, electronics get better, they get smaller, they get more reliable. One of the limitations, though, was it had the same fire control system as the Terrier. And what that meant was one target at a time, right? So much like I believe a Sparrow back in the day, right? Could only, if you were in your Hornet with a Sparrow missile, you could only engage one target at a time. Is that correct?
Correct. Yeah, there's a certain staring function or staring mode of the radar we would use. You don't only illuminate one target, so you're right. It'd be one target, one kill kind of
Right.
prosecution. Yeah.
Right. So if you imagine a warship could have two, maybe three illuminators, each illuminator is its own fire control.
Hmm.
So that meant you were limited to one target per illuminator until culmination of the intercept, right? Which is great in 1940s, 1950s, but as we start to get into the 1960s and talk about mass Badger and backfire raids with say two or three missiles per Soviet ship,
Hmm.
then that's not going to do it, right?
You
So
see,
that was the limitation of the SM-1.
okay, so in the kill chain, just to summarize, the kill chain of SM1, right? The
Mm-hmm.
the limiting factor, limfac, is actually the target queuing, if you or sorry, missile queuing to the target. And because
Yeah,
this is
yeah.
this is
The
days before the Aegis, right, and all that stuff?
Yes, this is probably 20 years, 15 years before Aegis enters the fleet.
Okay.
And so you are very much one director, one illuminator, one target. You're limited to how many missiles you can have in the air at one time. And the SM-1 MR still went out to about 40 nautical miles, right? We sort of hit that limit with what we had in the Terrier body with the booster, the small booster, and what it had. And we actually kept the SM-1 around for a long time. It was the Oliver Hazard Perry class frigate, which we didn't get rid of until I think about 2010. That was the missile of choice
Mhm.
for that frigate, which that sort of broke the mold. We did away with frigates after I don't want to say after the Second World War. We had ASW frigates into the 60s. The Perry class was this idea of we need a relatively inexpensive ship that we can have a lot of that can escort merchant vessels across the Pacific for reforger, return of forces to Germany if World War III had broken out. So she did ASW and anti-air warfare. So we carried her on there. And then those steam cruisers I was telling you about, which were the cruisers that came after things like the Long Beach, these enormous cruisers, they were more of the size that we think of as a Ticonderoga today, right? So they would have been a light cruiser
Mhm. Okay.
back in the Second World War in terms of size and displacement. And in fact, when they were first commissioned, these steam cruisers, they were called DLGs. They were going to be destroyer leaders guided missile. So
TL.
they were seen as sort of a flotilla flagship for destroyers. Changed it to cruisers. It's political, does all that. Those ships obviously didn't have Aegis, and they were never upgraded with something that was called New Threat Upgrade or NTU. And NTU was something that came along in the late 70s, early 80s, and it upgraded any non Aegis ship to have an almost Aegis like capability. And, we could talk about that in brief. I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole on Aegis and what that means because it's not really germane to standard. And I think we could do a whole show just on that. But the Aegis weapon system consists of what everyone thinks about is the phased array radars, right? The fixed arrays that don't have to rotate and they do passive and now active beam forming. But it's more than that. It's the processing system and it's the data link system as well. So when you asked earlier about, well, can I talk to this ship or that other ship? We couldn't do that really until NTU came along,
Gotcha.
and we'll talk about that here in a second with the SM-2. But for those non-NTU ships that were hanging out sort of in the Cold War, we didn't really want to get rid of these older ships until that was over. The non-NTU ships and the Perry class frigates had the SM-1 MR medium range, and that would go to about 40 nautical miles. We hope you're enjoying SM-2 on Authentic. Join Sunshine and Roger next time as they finish the story with the introduction of Aegis, the SM-2 proper, and its follow-on variants. See you next time. We at Authentic appreciate your subscribing to our channel. If you'd like to help us bring more content and grow the channel, leave a rating and a review on your listening platform of choice and tell a friend. Thanks for listening.